in a world where everything becomes cheaper just to win. In the end, no one really wins. For years, China's rise looked unstoppable. The factory of the world, cities that never slept, production lines that never paused, and prices that fell a little more each day. It went so far that Western competitors simply gave up. This was the story of a civilization that turned human labor into a near-perfect machine. But every miracle demands a price, and China's greatest strength, the ability to produce everything faster, bigger, and cheaper, is now turning into a weakness weighing heavily on its own shoulders. Where money, power, and history intersect, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. China's story is a story that pushes modern capitalism to its limits. And it forces us to ask, what happens when the world's largest economy perfects itself to the point of slowly consuming itself? To find the answer, we have to return to the beginning of the so-called Chinese miracle. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping stepped forward and said something that broke one of socialism's biggest taboos. Getting rich is not a shame. On the contrary, it is loving your country. With those words, he set off one of the fastest economic transformations in history. Farmers became entrepreneurs, fields filled with factories, and investors from Japan, the United States, and Europe poured into China. Because they all saw the same opportunity: cheap labor, endless manpower, and a government eager to make deals. China launched several test cities, special economic zones, no rigid planning, no heavy bureaucracy, no ideological filters. Only one goal: attract capital and grow exports. And the formula worked so well that Shenzhen, once a tiny fishing village of 30,000, exploded into a city of millions. Success spread like wildfire. Every city wanted to become the next Shenzhen. Local leaders took on huge debts to attract more factories, building roads, power plants, massive industrial zones. By the 2000s, China wasn't just growing, it was consuming the world economy. Steel, coal, copper, oil, everything. Western companies could barely survive unless they moved production to China. If something could be manufactured, sooner or later it would be made in China. But beneath this incredible rise was a dangerous engine. Success depended on being cheaper than everyone else. Local governments slashed land prices to lure factories. Companies cut quality to stay alive. Profits disappeared, but production kept growing. This wasn't a race toward progress. It was a sprint toward collapse. Only nobody realized it yet. While millions of migrant workers filled factories, laboring 12 hours a day, the West experienced its own consumer miracle. $5 t-shirts, $300 iPhones, prices that barely moved. And China grew rich until the system could no longer carry its own weight. By 2015, China's steel capacity alone exceeded the rest of the world combined. Factories kept producing goods no one needed at a pace no one could absorb. Prices fell, not because of innovation, but out of desperation. And a new word began rising inside China: involution. This was no longer about people working harder for less. It was about entire industries producing more, for less. A system locked inside itself. Solar panels, electric vehicles, batteries, all those industries we thought represented China's future, turned into brutal price wars. Margins evaporated, wages stagnated, products got cheaper. But this cheapness wasn't a gift. It was a warning. That's why Chinese solar panels today are sold below cost. That's why massive parking lots are filled with unsold electric cars. That's why industrial profits fell more than 20%, even as exports hit records. Because when price becomes your only weapon, the only thing left that can fall is the price itself. This isn't capitalism in overdrive. It's capitalism devouring itself. The ironic part? China has seen this movie before. In the 2000s, when overproduction in coal and steel reached breaking point, the government shut down hundreds of mines, merged factories, and laid off thousands. It was an economic triage operation. Today, it's happening again. But this time, the patient isn't a single sector. It's the entire economic model. Factories in China don't close because they're unprofitable. They close only if politics allows it. And in Chinese politics, shutting down is not rewarded. Movement is. If the machine stops, the illusion stops. From the outside, China's economy still looks strong. Record exports, new factories, a constant flow of technology. But inside, profits are collapsing, wages are tightening, and a massive question grows. At what cost? Here lies China's real fragility. When cheapness stops being a strategy, it becomes a habit, and economies gain their most dangerous addictions from their habits. If every sector expects the state to cover losses, innovation dies. Productivity becomes political, and national strategy transforms into national burden. This is not just an economic battle, it is a silent time bomb, because no system can produce at a loss forever. Not even a state. And history's harshest lesson is this: empires don't collapse from lack of demand. They collapse from lack of purpose. China's growth machine is still turning, but not because it creates wealth. It turns because it must. Local governments depend on constant output to service their debts. Banks depend on factories to justify their balance sheets. And the central government depends on both to preserve the appearance of full employment. This is not a strategy, it is a survival reflex. And cheapness, after a point, stops being success and becomes self-destruction. China built the most powerful production engine modern history has ever seen. But now that same engine is hollowing itself out. The problem isn't that China produces too little. It's that China produces too much. So much that it erodes profit, value, and meaning. It floods the world with abundance, while thinning out its own prosperity. The irony of history is clear. What becomes most expensive for an empire is producing too cheaply. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History holds all the answers,